Well, shall I make a start then?
Yes, please.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Daniela and Liufeng, for organising such a great meeting. I'm deeply impressed by the number of delegates you've attracted to your event. I would like to be in the same room as you to be able to say hello in person, but I guess one of the few advantages of the current situation is that we can have delegates from all around the world and so many people joining us to talk about what we're all doing with OpenFOAM. As Daniela pointed out, one of my main areas of research at the moment for the last few years has been automated optimization. And so I've chosen to take that as a topic for my presentation, specifically Bayesian optimization, which is a form of machine learning and which I think has great potential in terms of techniques for automated optimization of problems using CFD. So I'll make a start. Let's talk about what Bayesian optimization actually represents. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the fact that CFD can be used as part of a design process. As soon as you set up one model, one calculation, and get it to run, you typically start running different design variations and so forth. And you might come up with 4 or 5 different designs you want to test in this way. And this is a human-driven design process. And it's one of the main aspects that CFD is used for. Now, as computers have become more powerful and computational costs have reduced, we have more power to apply to this, and we can use this in 2 ways. We can use it to improve the quality of our calculations, so more complex models for the physics, finer meshes and so forth, but we can also use it to run many more different cases. And this opens the possibility of an automated design process in CFD. Why automated? Well, 2 reasons. First of all, it's more efficient in terms of us as human beings. If I asked you to run 5 variants of a car, you would probably be quite happy to do that. If I gave you 500 different design variations and told you to simulate all of them, you would probably hit me with something. So automating the process is beneficial if you're going to run that number of cases. But also, it enables us to fully explore the parameter space without any kind of human bias. Now, if you are an experienced automotive engineer, you may well feel that your grasp of the fluid dynamics and the design constraints here makes you a good person to examine what's going on through CFD. But even so, an automated process may come up with designs you just hadn't thought about. So being able to automate the process may well be of benefit in a number of directions. Now, many of you are probably familiar with some of the approaches which are being investigated. Adjoint optimization is a significant aspect here, something which is commonly used in the automotive industry. And basically, you are differentiating Navier-Stokes equations to find the sensitivity of your solution to changes in the design. It's a technique which is computationally reasonably cheap. Once you set it up to run, the adjoint system takes 1 pass through a solver, but setting it up requires extensive mathematical work. So it's been applied extensively in areas such as automotive, where you can set up the equations once and then apply them over and over again. But if you are looking at a range of different problems, each time you try a new problem, you typically have to spend a long time setting up the set of equations. Another approach, which you may be familiar with, is evolutionary, so genetic algorithms. And these days we're quite well aware of how quickly things like viruses evolve to become better viruses. So we can apply the same sort of thing here. You code your design in terms of entries in a virtual genome, create a population of these entries, select the best ones according to some criteria, and then virtually breed a new population. And over time, this process, generation by generation, explores your parameter space very effectively in multiple dimensions, and can find the global rather than the local maxima or minima or optima, basically. The advantage is you don't need to do the mathematical background work, but you do have to do a potentially vast number of evaluations, which, if your evaluation of the fitness involves running a CFD model, this can be extremely expensive. In fact, we very often apply this by way of a surrogate model. So instead of trying to run a CFD simulation 10,000 times, we will run it, say, 100 times and use this to create or possibly train a cheaper surrogate or reduced order model to take the place of the CFD model in our evaluations, basically. Now, can we go further with this? Well, yes. Once we've got our surrogate model, then actually doing the optimization is relatively straightforward. So what I think we should focus on here is improving the surrogate model. And this is basically what the Bayesian optimization process looks like. We're going to start with a surrogate model using a process called kriging, or Gaussian process emulation, and then iteratively we're going to improve the quality of that surrogate model, particularly focusing in those areas of parameter space which we're particularly interested in. So here's a cartoon I stole from somewhere online here, because it illustrates very nicely how the process is working. And in Bayesian optimization, we actually have two important functions: an objective function and an acquisition function. Now, the objective function, which is this dashed line here, is our attempt at an approximation to the true response function, the true cost function for the system. That cost function is this solid line here, and of course we don't know what that looks like, except at a limited number of points where we've chosen to run our CFD model. And the interpolation between those points uses this Gaussian process, which gives us a guess at where how the function behaves, but also a range at these points representing the range of probable solutions here. And that's a Gaussian distribution around this objective function. So we've got some concept as to how accurate or inaccurate the model is and what the range of possible solutions might be. But then we've also got an acquisition function which works with the objective function and is used to identify the best location to run our next CFD model. And that is not necessarily at the optimum. Now, we can see from this illustration here that currently our objective function has a global maximum over here. So we might want to improve that by running another calculation. But we already know very accurately the cost function here, so this may not be the best place to run the calculation. So instead, we might realize that over here we think it's lower, but we see from the objective function there's a possibility that the maximum is actually over here. So we want to run our CFD model here in order to either eliminate or possibly identify the cost function in this region. And so each iteration of this process, we're basically asking the question, based on what we already know about the system, where is the best place to run the next calculation? And those of you who've done any probability may recognize that as a Bayesian approach to probability theory, which is why this is known as Bayesian optimization. Now, I'm lucky enough to work in a university with a very strong computer science department with a number of people who are working in this sort of area. And my introduction to this was through a project one of my colleagues, Richard Everson, two of my colleagues actually, Richard Everson and Jonathan Fieldsend, invited me to join a few years ago, which combined Bayesian approaches with CFD in order to couple the two. And we developed, or rather the postdocs involved, Alma Rahat and Stephen Daniels, developed a complete framework in Python, which implements various aspects of Bayesian optimization on the computer science side, but also links to CFD packages to do the evaluation, and particularly OpenFOAM, both because I was on the grant and also because PyFOAM represents an excellent interface between CFD runs and the rest of the package. The project's finished a couple of years ago, but we also picked up after that and based on it an industrial project, a KTP, with a company called Hydro International. And so we are through that project working on applying these techniques in real engineering problems. I might add the code here is open source, it's available, so if you follow through to Alma's Bitbucket site here, you can download the papers and the Python code here and have a go with what we've done and maybe apply it to some of your own problems. So I'd like to spend the next bit of my talk talking about 4 example optimizations we've done and then say a few words to close. Now, I kind of look at this as a building up of the complexity. The first 2 examples here, a heat exchanger and a diffuser, they're worthwhile engineering problems, but we simplified them to use them as trial problems to develop and improve the methodology. Then the other 2 cases, the draft tube and the vortex separator, which we'll come on to later, are much more complex problems which we regarded as actual engineering optimizations. And as I say, the vortex separator case is something that Hydro International is very interested in. So let's talk about these trial cases first of all. And the first one we looked at here is to optimize the properties of a standard cross-flow heat exchanger. And we've simplified this a long way. We've got hot pipes here, which are at a constant temperature, and we've got a cool water flowing in, interacting with them, heating up and flowing out again. We've chosen a flow rate, which makes this a laminar and steady state problem. So we're going to run simple foam as a laminar code here. And the temperature is a passive scalar here. And basically what we're trying to optimize here is an arrangement of positions and sizes of these pipes, well, it can do 2 things. It can maximize the heat transfer and at the same time minimize the wasted flow energy, so minimize the pressure drop across the system. And these 2 requirements are very much in opposition to each other because you increase the heat transfer by increasing the coupling between the flow and the surfaces, and that increases the pressure drop. So we're going to get a balance between the 2 of them. And this slide illustrates the type of thing we often come across in multi-objective optimization. We don't necessarily find one overall optimum solution. We find a collection of solutions called a Pareto front, which represents a balance, a trade-off between, in this case, the 2 parameters, the temperature increase and the pressure drop. I'm going to mention that we evaluate this by a process of optimizing the hypervolume. We choose a point here, and for the set of points, we construct a stepped rectangular area here, which represents the area occupied by this. The Pareto front technically are the non-dominated solutions. A solution here is said to be dominated because it can be improved by a solution over here, both in terms of the pressure drop and the temperature change, whereas the point on here on the Pareto front, if I choose this one, for example, I can increase the temperature difference, but only at the cost of also increasing the pressure drop. So these points, the Pareto front, are our non-dominated solutions, and we can evaluate these by trying to increase the size of the hypervolume represented by this front. That's just a small technical detail which I'm going to use later on in some of my later slides. And this slide as a whole shows you the Pareto front. We've run something like 200 calculations to get there. And this is our base solution and one of the Pareto front solutions over here, which is a slightly odd distribution of pipes of different sizes and different locations. And each of these elements on the Pareto front will be a different combination there. As you can see here, this was a separate run starting with slightly different arrangement, and you can see we've done 400 evaluations to get here, which have constructed this Pareto front, which represent some very odd solutions and also some not so odd solutions here. And we can work out, for example, why this might have a lower pressure drop compared to something over here. Now, I mentioned a second simple problem here we looked at, which was that of a diffuser. Now, again, this is an engineering problem, but we've simplified it to make it as straightforward to calculate. Diffusers are used in a range of different examples to reduce flow velocity and to increase static pressure. And they've also been studied quite extensively to optimize them. A simple optimization would be to find the ideal angle alpha here for this flat surface. But a more complicated optimization might be to allow this surface, this line here, to be a curve of some description. And we've actually represented it as what's called a Catmull-Clark subdivision curve. Don't worry about this. I don't understand that bit either. Go and look it up if you want to understand about it. And we investigated various meshing options, and actually we've used CF mesh to mesh the calculation, mesh the domain here. And we ran this for a steady state case, but with turbulence using K omega SST model. And depending on how many control points we use, we get various different Pareto fronts. Again, it's a two-objective optimization here. So using one control point, we get quite smooth, simple geometries. And the baseline here, which is a straight surface, can obviously be significantly improved by using these curved surfaces. But we can go to more complicated geometries for this by increasing the number of control points, which very interestingly radically reduced the size of the Pareto front. So here, this is an example where there is a rather odd but very good optimal solution to be had here. Okay, I'm trying to fit this into half an hour to avoid eating into Phil Cardiff's time. So I'm going to quickly move on to the third example here, which is a draft tube. And this is a structure in hydroelectric power generation, which takes water from the turbine and returns it to a river. And again, this is a structure which can be optimized, in fact has to be optimized. We want to reduce the amount of energy lost by friction, but slightly counterintuitively, I think, increase the pressure change. The outlet pressure here is always atmospheric, so we want to get the lowest possible pressure here to draw the water through. And there's a test case here called the Holland-Foss and Kaplan draft tube, which has been extensively studied, a series of workshops run by Erkov-Tak, both in terms of studied to improve our knowledge of CFD applied to this, but also as an optimization process. So there's a lot of background knowledge here. In optimization terms, we can split the geometry into an inlet cone, taking the outlet from the turbine, an elbow, and a diffuser. And most optimizations, in fact, we think all optimizations thus far have attempted to optimize one of these elements, whereas we are trying to optimize all of them. Now, to have any kind of basis for this, we need to validate our modeling. We need to show that we're actually calculating correct results. And there's a lot of background experiment and CFD data here to validate against. So we've done an extensive validation study here. This is just one part of it, but this gave us confidence we're actually calculating the right result. And then based on that, we can now run our optimization calculations. This is three-dimensional, so it takes a lot longer to run the calculations, not a few minutes, but a few hours. But nevertheless, in 200 overall evaluations, we're able to find a pretty good example of a Pareto front, including designs which maybe you would have thought of in reality, but also some slightly more unusual ones where we had to think carefully to see that, yes, this is a genuine optimal solution. And we actually reran the case 10 times. There is an element of stochasticity here. So each individual optimization is likely to give us a different Pareto front. We wanted to check how similar those Pareto fronts were to give an estimate of the range of solutions here. My final example here, which is one which we are now working on at the moment, this KTP project with Hydro International. And Hydro International are an SME company working in sustainable urban drainage. And a lot of their products involve control of water vortices. One of their products is this head cell separator, which cleans particulates from urban water, from runoff water, to return it to the natural environment. And it works a bit like a Dyson vacuum cleaner. The water is injected here into a structure of nested conic baffles, and this encourages it to rotate in a series of vortices. The interaction, that flow with the baffles, the conical baffles, encourages the particles to separate out and accumulate at the bottom here. And they can be then pumped out and removed, whilst the clean water essentially is displaced to the top of the structure here and can be pulled off and returned to the natural environment. So it's basically a Dyson vacuum cleaner for water. And you can see there are two stages to the simulation process. We can run something like simple foam to get the overall flow patterns and then track the particles through the system using parcel foam type codes in order to identify how much is collecting at the bottom and how much is going out over the top. This is an example simulation which Stephen, who started this work, animated for me to demonstrate the physics. Again, we want to validate this, and this has been quite a complicated process. Hydro International has got a very well-equipped fluids lab and have done a lot of experimentation with this, and so has provided the experimental data here together with the experimental error bars. And we're able to simulate this for different nozzle velocities, and those are the darker colors here. But we ran into an issue here. The flow itself is actually unsteady, although we are running simple foam and running it steady state. And the particle tracking itself is stochastic. So we need to understand how many parcels to run through, and we found that something around 10,000 particles gives good results, and also understand the changes in the flow solution depending on how far we run simple foam. And in fact, Andrew Roberts, who is currently doing this work, took one of these cases and after convergence continued to run it and extracted the results for various different points after the simulation had technically finished, and that's given us an error bar, an estimate of the uncertainty in the CFD. We're able to use this to run the optimization. So here's our initial sample of 62 to construct our initial surrogate model, and then a further 53 Bayesian samples to refine it. And you can see here how the hypervolume has increased as we think we have got to the ideal Pareto front. Now, just to finish, I wanted to mention a couple of things we're working on at the moment, and these are things we're investigating in the Bayesian process, not necessarily yet applied to the CFD. My computer science colleagues want to run the Bayesian process in serial mode, so one evaluation after the other, because in their terms, that's the most efficient way of doing it. So I'm sure you can appreciate in the real world and in terms of CFD, we have access to big computers with thousands of processing elements. We want to run this in parallel. So we've investigated techniques to do this, in particular asynchronous batch parallelization, developed by a guy called Alvey in 2019. And in this case, we run a number of evaluations simultaneously and try and parallelize the Bayesian process based on that. And this can give a very significant speed up. Of course, there is the issue here that if you're running a number of evaluations at the same time, one of them or several of them may become redundant based on results from other ones in the batch. So there is a trade-off here, but one which we think is worth doing. The other thing we've been looking at is failure handling relating to the meshing. And again, this is something we've worked on in theory in a trial test cases. There's a case here, the DLTZ2 problem, which is commonly used in optimization, in Bayesian optimization. And we're trying to investigate how we can get the process to learn what works in terms of the meshing. Now, CFD can fail in a number of ways, often related to the quality of the mesh. We may be able to detect this by running check mesh, which is a nice cheap thing to do, but doesn't necessarily tell us whether or not our eventual solution will work and be correct. Alternatively, we can actually run the calculation and find it doesn't converge, and that's expensive. So what we want to do is to try and learn, get an algorithm to learn what works and what doesn't work. So we set up this DLTZ2 system, which is trying to optimize to this arc in space here and knocked out an area here which we declared our simulations wouldn't work. We can introduce a penalization function which permanently or temporarily penalizes the expected improvement in this area, and we can introduce an additional surrogate function to learn that aspect, and it's learned to avoid this region of parameter space in terms of its evaluation. So I think I've got one more minute here, so I'm trying to finish dead on time. CFD is a major part of modern engineering, and in particular areas where we're doing optimization and things like digital simulation and Industry 4.0. We now have resources, which mean we can provide accurate answers for these complicated problems, but also we can do automated optimization. And we are now pulling in techniques from machine learning to do this. Now, you may not recognize this as machine learning because we think of machine learning very often in terms of huge data sets, what I call big data machine learning. In fact, I'd like to call this sparse data machine learning. But that's a good place to finish. I'll circulate these slides. I'd like to acknowledge and thank my research group and various colleagues. And there's a list here of the papers which we've published here if you'd like to follow up on this. And I think that's a good place to finish. So I'll stop the share.